picture a pristine, bright white dress shirt.
Yeah.
You just bought it. You pull it out of the packaging, you put it on, and you head into the kitchen to pour your morning coffee.
And we all know exactly where this is going.
Oh, yeah. Your hand slips. Dark, oily coffee splashes squarely onto the center of your chest. And, we instinctively understand how the physical world works in that moment. It stains. It leaves a permanent mark.
Right. It ruins the fabric.
Exactly. You wouldn't look at that dark, ruined shirt and think, I know exactly how to fix this. Let me just pour a massive glass of dark red wine directly over the stain.
No, you definitely would not do that.
Because it defies every intuitive law of purification. You don't clean a pigment with another pigment. You don't wash away a stain with something that, inherently stains.
Right.
But then you step into the world of biblical theology, and that exact physical logic is flipped completely upside down.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are stepping into a really profound mission. We are exploring this fascinating intersection where rigorous human biology meets deep biblical theology.
Yeah, it's a very unique crossover.
It really is. Our source material today is a chapter from Ozair da Silva Mota's book, Analysis Biblico-Scientificas, Biblical Scientific Analyses. And Mota is basically attempting to understand these massive, abstract spiritual doctrines through the completely uncompromising lens of scientific laws and human anatomy.
Which is such an ambitious project.
So ambitious. And the specific paradox we're looking at today is how the human circulatory system explains the concept of spiritual salvation.
Yeah, and it really is the ultimate paradox of purification, because Mota forces us to confront this glaring contradiction between our everyday tactile reality, like your coffee stain example, and these ancient biblical claims.
Right.
Because in our human experience, outside the body, blood is something that ruins whatever it touches.
Absolutely.
We scrub it out with hydrogen peroxide with bleach. Yet in texts like 1 John 1.7 and Hebrews 9.14, blood is presented not as a contaminant, but as the absolute ultimate cleansing agent.
Okay, let's unpack this right here.
Yeah.
Because I have to play the skeptic for a second.
Well,
on behalf of anyone listening who finds this imagery just, difficult to process.
sure, yeah.
Because if I cut my finger and bleed on the carpet, my first instinct is panic, followed immediately by grabbing a heavy-duty carpet cleaner. The visceral reaction to blood is usually avoidance, or, let's be honest, even disgust.
Yeah, it's considered a biohazard today.
Right. So how could early Christians, or even us today, possibly wrap our heads around blood acting as a detergent rather than a stain? It just feels incredibly counterintuitive.
It does. And to bridge that gap, Mota argues that we have to entirely deconstruct our modern, hyper-sanitized view of bodily fluids. We have to step into the biological and theological framework of the ancient Near East.
Okay, so take us back there. What was their framework?
Well, in the Old Testament context, blood is not merely a biological byproduct or, a stain on a carpet. It is the absolute most expressive biological representation of life itself.
The physical liquid of life.
Exactly. The ancients understood something fundamentally true. When the blood drains, the life departs. It is the physical manifestation of vitality. So when blood is spilled, or specifically when it's offered in these ancient texts, it signifies the utmost seriousness. It represents absolute commitment and just an immense, unfathomable cost.
So it's basically the ultimate currency.
Right.
But why is the cost so extreme? Because we're talking about human failing, right?
Yeah.
Sin, mistakes, moral breaches. I think a lot of people today view sin as just a psychological misstep, maybe a lapse in judgment.
Yeah, or an outdated concept entirely.
Right, like something you can just apologize for and move on.
And that's where Mota's premise really challenges us, because it hinges on redefining that casual view of sin. He argues that sin is not a minor infraction. It's not a social faux pas or like a parking ticket you can just pay off and forget about. The theological framework states that the cost of sin, the ultimate consequence of spiritual corruption, is life itself. It brings forth death.
So the stakes are absolute.
Absolute,
Yeah.
absolute, yeah. Therefore, the purifying agent, the mechanism to actually reverse that death, it has to be an equal exchange. It must be life itself.
Which means blood.
Which is why blood is required.
Right.
The text argues that this requirement was ultimately and perfectly fulfilled by Christ, who voluntarily surrendered his life, his blood at Calvary.
Okay, so I understand the ancient framework of an equal exchange, a life for a life.
I'm there.
But that still leaves us with the physical paradox. Even if life is the required currency, how does a liquid that causes stains act as a cleanser?
Right, the detergent question.
Yeah. And the author suggests that to solve this, we have to entirely shift our perspective. We have to stop looking at blood outside the body where it hits the floor or ruins a shirt, and instead look at what it actually does inside the human anatomy.
Because inside the body, blood isn't a stain at all.
No, not at all. It functions as the most sophisticated, microscopic cleaning mechanism in existence.
Yeah, we're shifting from the macroscopic world of ruined laundry to the microscopic world of cellular metabolism.
It's a huge pivot.
It is.
Yeah.
Because the reality of human biology is that your body is constantly, incessantly producing metabolic waste. Every second of every day, your, trillions of cells?
Trillions, yeah.
They're working. They're converting nutrients into energy. They're building proteins, repairing tissue. And as a byproduct of simply keeping you alive, they generate trash.
Literally toxic waste.
Yes. Furthermore, we don't live in a vacuum. We're constantly absorbing external toxic agents, from the polluted air we breathe, the chemically treated water we drink, the processed food we eat.
So we're essentially walking, talking toxic waste factories. If we didn't have a way to handle that trash, the very act of living would kill us.
Exactly. The biological term for that buildup is toxemia. If that metabolic waste were allowed to just accumulate in your tissues, your cells would essentially drown in their own refuse. And that leads to systemic organ failure and death in a matter of days.
So what stops that from happening?
The circulatory system. The blood flowing through your veins and arteries is the hero that prevents this. But here's the key point. The blood doesn't destroy the waste itself.
Oh, it doesn't.
No, it acts as an incredibly efficient, high-speed conveyor belt. It sweeps through every microscopic capillary, picks up these toxins, and transports them to the body's dedicated biological water treatment plants.
The kidneys.
The kidneys.
And the source material spends a lot of time mapping out the exact biological specifications of these organs. And it's so fascinating because when you think of a water treatment plant for an entire city, you picture acres of vats, chemical processors, huge infrastructure.
Concrete everywhere.
Right. So how large are the human body's filtration plants?
They are shockingly compact. We are talking about 2 organs located toward the back of the abdominal cavity, just below the rib cage. Each one is roughly 12 centimeters long, so less than 5 inches, and they weigh about 150 grams each.
That is basically the weight and size of a standard smartphone.
Yeah.
That is wild. 2 small smartphones sitting in your lower back are responsible for filtering the entire ocean of blood in your body. How do they actually accomplish that on a mechanical level? Like, what is happening inside those 12 centimeters?
Well, the macroscopic organ is just the housing. The real miracle happens at the microscopic level. Each kidney contains approximately 1 million functional independent filtration units.
1 million in each one.
Yeah, they're called nephrons. And at the head of every single nephron is a structure called a glomerulus. The glomeruli are essentially microscopic, tightly coiled knots of high-pressure blood capillaries, and they act as the actual physical sieves for your bloodstream.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize this. So the heart pumps blood down the descending aorta, pushing it into the renal arteries, which branch off into the kidneys. That high-pressure blood is forced into these millions of tiny glomeruli knots. And these microscopic filters somehow have to sort the good elements from the bad elements in fractions of a second. They have to pull out the unwanted metabolic waste. And the text specifically mentions toxins like urea, creatinine, and uric acid.
Yes, and what's fascinating here is let's look closely at those specific toxins because they really highlight the lethal nature of metabolic waste.
Okay.
Take urea, for example. It's created in the liver when proteins are broken down. It's a way for the body to safely transport toxic ammonia.
Which is basically bleach, right?
Basically. And then there's creatinine, which is a chemical waste product generated from typical muscle wear and tear, just from moving around.
Yeah.
And uric acid is produced when your body breaks down purines, which are found in certain foods and drinks.
So these are just normal byproducts of being a human.
Completely normal. But if the glomeruli fail to pull these specific chemicals out of the blood, they crystallize in the joints, they poison the nervous system, and they ultimately shut down the brain.
Wow. You know, an analogy comes to mind here. I'm picturing the glomeruli as millions of microscopic bouncers standing at the velvet rope of an incredibly exclusive nightclub, the bloodstream.
I like that.
Right. And they are checking the chemical ID of every single molecule, every single drop of fluid that rushes toward them.
Yeah.
And they have to make split-second life or death decisions like, you're a red blood cell. Cool. You're on the VIP list. Head back into the party. You're a molecule of uric acid. Absolutely not. You're getting kicked out the back door into the ureter to become urine.
It's a great visual, but the bouncer analogy works, but we can actually refine it to show just how radical the kidney design actually is.
Oh, really? How so?
Because the normal bouncer stops bad elements from entering, right?
Right.
The glomerulus actually kicks almost everyone out of the club first.
Wait, what?
Yeah. The pressure in those capillaries is so incredibly high that it squeezes a massive amount of water, nutrients, and toxins out of the blood entirely. It basically empties the club.
Oh, my God.
And then, as that fluid travels down the microscopic tubes of the nephron, the kidney actively pulls the VIPs, the water, the glucose, the essential amino acids. It pulls them back into the bloodstream, leaving only the highly concentrated waste to be expelled.
So it's a system of total filtration and selective reabsorption.
Exactly.
That is even more exhausting to think about. It's tossing the entire crowd out onto the street and then carefully inviting the good guest back inside millions of times a minute without us ever consciously directing it.
Yeah,
It's an astonishing piece of engineering.
it really is. And Mota uses this precise biological marvel as direct evidence of a hyper-complex, perfectly calibrated system created by an intelligent designer. And to drive home the sheer scale of what those 250-gram organs are accomplishing, the text contrasts healthy human kidneys with our absolute best attempt at replicating them, which is the hemodialysis machine.
Right. The machine used when someone goes into renal failure. So if the biological filters shut down, we have to hook the patient up to artificial ones.
Right. Human engineering has to step in to prevent that toxemia we talked about. And just look at the footprint of a hemodialysis machine. It is the size of a large refrigerator.
Huge.
It requires electricity, highly specialized chemical dialysate fluids, and constant monitoring by trained medical professionals. A patient has to sit tethered to this machine for roughly 4 hours at a time, usually 3 days a week.
That is such a heavy burden.
It is. And even with all of that massive infrastructure, that machine is only attempting to partially replicate the filtration efficiency that your two tiny kidneys perform silently, seamlessly, and continuously every single second of your existence.
The disparity is staggering. A massive, loud machine struggling to do a fraction of the work of two silent organs the size of smartphones.
Yeah.
But the kidneys, as complex as they only handle liquid and solid metabolic waste, right? They manage the chemistry of the blood. But our cells don't just produce chemical byproducts. They also produce gaseous waste. Every time a cell creates energy, it exhausts carbon dioxide. And if the blood only dropped off toxins at the kidneys, we would still die of asphyxiation from the inside out.
Yes, we would.
So the conveyor belt has to make another stop.
It does. The circulatory system requires a secondary biological purification plant to handle the continuous production of carbon dioxide. And this leads us to the lungs.
Okay.
So the kidneys handle the metabolic fluids, but the lungs manage the volatile gases. And the source material provides anatomical specifications here as well to really ground the analogy. The lungs are these spongy, highly elastic organs measuring about 25 centimeters in length and weighing between 600 to 700 grams each.
Okay, so they are significantly larger and heavier than the kidneys, occupying the majority of the chest cavity, kind of wrapping around the heart.
Right.
But it's not their outer dimensions that are mind-bending, it's what is folded up inside them.
Yeah, their internal architecture is designed to solve a very specific physical problem. And that problem is, how do you expose as much blood to as much air as possible within a confined space?
Because it's a tight squeeze in there.
It is. And the solution is the alveoli. The text notes that the human lungs contain approximately 200 to 300 million of these microscopic balloon-like air sacs.
300 million. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material points out a statistic about these alveoli that completely breaks my brain.
Oh, the surface area.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you were to take those 300 million microscopic balloons, cut them open, and lay the membrane tissue out completely flat, they would create a surface area of up to 70 square meters.
Which is huge.
That is roughly the square footage of a small two-bedroom apartment. You have an entire apartment's worth of biological surface area folded, compressed, and crammed behind your ribs. How is that even physically possible?
Well, it is an exercise in pure fractal geometry. By constantly branching smaller and smaller, from the trachea to the bronchi, down to the bronchioles, and finally the spherical alveoli, the lungs create this massive labyrinth of surface area.
It's beautiful, really.
It is. And that massive 70 square meter boundary is absolutely critical because the wall of an alveolus is incredibly thin. We're talking often only 1 cell thick.
Wow.
So on one side of that wall is the air you just inhaled, and on the exact opposite side is a microscopic blood capillary.
Carrying venous blood, Blood that has just finished its lap around the body, dropped off its chemical waste at the kidneys, and is now loaded with dark, toxic carbon dioxide.
Exactly.
So it arrives at this massive 70-square-meter apartment wall inside your chest. What happens at that boundary line?
A physical process called gas diffusion occurs and is driven entirely by partial pressure gradients because nature abhors an imbalance.
Right, it always wants to equalize.
Exactly. So the blood arriving at the lungs has a high concentration of carbon dioxide and almost no oxygen. The air inside the alveolus has a high concentration of oxygen and almost no carbon dioxide. So because the membrane is so thin, the gases simply swap places to find equilibrium.
Just automatically.
Just automatically. The hemoglobin in the red blood cells releases its grip on the carbon dioxide, dumping it into the lung to be exhaled. And in the exact same millisecond, that empty hemoglobin violently binds to the fresh oxygen you just breathed in.
It is effectively dropping off the garbage and picking up the groceries in the exact same motion. It doesn't, like, drop off the CO2, drive down the street, and then pick up the O2. It is a simultaneous, instantaneous exchange.
Yes. And the text emphasizes the simultaneous nature of this dual action heavily. It is the defining characteristic of the circulatory system, because without continuous blood flow, there is no oxygenation and there is no waste removal.
They depend entirely on each other.
Right. The blood is tasked with executing two completely opposite functions at the exact same moment. It is feeding the body with life-sustaining oxygen while concurrently purifying the body by extracting lethal carbon dioxide. Feeding and cleansing, intertwined in a single heartbeat.
It is a brilliant, undeniable biological reality. We can measure the oxygen saturation, we can track the urea output.
But can see it working.
Yeah. But the mission of this deep dive isn't just an advanced anatomy lesson, right?
Yeah.
The author's goal is to take this airtight physical model of the lungs and the kidneys, this dual action of feeding and removing, and map it directly onto the spiritual plane.
That's the real core of his thesis.
So how do we take the biological pathology of physical toxins, the urea, creatinine, CO2, and translate that to what Mota refers to as the pathology of spiritual toxins?
This is the major pivot in Mota's argument. He moves from biological science to deep theological analogy. His premise is that the physical world is essentially a mirror of the spiritual world. So, just as physical toxins are introduced into the body through both external absorption from the environment and internal production by our own metabolism, sin operates in the exact same dual manner within the human soul.
External absorption and internal production, the environmental pollution and the cellular waste. Let's break down how that applies to the concept of sin. If I'm understanding the analogy correctly, the external toxins would be the spiritual environment we live in, right?
Precisely. The human soul is constantly exposed to external spiritual pollutants. This happens through cultural influence, temptation, seduction, and the systemic corruption in the surrounding world. It is the moral equivalent of breathing in smog or drinking contaminated water.
Your environment directly impacts your internal health.
Yes. But Mota doesn't let humanity off the hook as mere victims of a toxic environment. He points to the internal production of toxins, too.
The cellular waste part of the analogy.
Exactly. The text references the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians, specifically chapter 5, where he explicitly categorizes the works of the flesh.
Behaviors like hatred, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition. Paul is basically arguing that human nature itself has a factory-installed inclination to produce spiritual waste. We generate our own toxicity simply by operating as broken humans.
We are endogenous producers of moral failure.
Endogenous meaning it comes from within.
Exactly. And to illustrate exactly how this spiritual toxemia began, Mota uses a very specific foundational case study. He takes the reader back to the absolute origin point in the biblical narrative, Genesis chapter 3, the encounter between the serpent and Eve in the garden.
The original contamination event.
Right.
And if we look at that interaction through this clinical biological lens, the serpent isn't just a talking animal, the serpent is the vector for a pathogen.
Yeah.
What exactly was the chemical makeup of the toxin the serpent introduced?
Well, the text dissects the anatomy of that original temptation. The toxin wasn't an apple. The toxin was a sophisticated deception. And it comprised 3 distinct molecular structures, if we want to keep the analogy going.
Yeah, what are the 3?
First, it was a subtle distortion of truth asking, did God really say? Second, it planted a seed of distrust in the benevolent character of the Creator. And third, it offered the grand illusion of absolute autonomy, this intoxicating promise that you will be like God, completely independent and self-defining.
I am so fascinated by the specific clinical vocabulary Mota uses to describe humanity's reaction to this deception, because the text states that this initial sin was assimilated, metabolized, and reproduced.
That's incredibly deliberate phrasing.
It is. It's scientific. It completely shifts the paradigm of what sin actually is. It implies that sin is not just a broken rule like jaywalking or cheating on a math test. It is an invasive spiritual pathogen.
Yes.
It's a virus that attaches to the host cell and literally rewrites its DNA.
It behaves exactly like a biological pathogen. Host will inevitably produce symptoms.
You're going to show signs of infection.
Right. Mota outlines the immediate cascading symptoms of this spiritual infection, as documented in Genesis 3. Almost instantaneously after assimilating the toxin after eating the fruit, the human operating system crashes.
And the symptoms are just so visceral. First, they experience shame. They suddenly realize they are naked, and their immediate instinct is to cover themselves.
Which had never happened before.
Never.
No.
Then comes fear. They hear God walking in the garden and they panic. That leads to flight. They hide among the trees. And finally, when confronted, the ultimate symptom is accusation. Adam blames Eve, and he even blames God for giving him Eve. Eve blames the serpent. The unity is completely shattered.
It is a systemic breakdown of the spiritual nervous system. Consider how a healthy physical body mounts an immune response to a viral invader, right?
Yeah.
Your temperature spikes to burn off the virus, causing a fever. Your tissues swell with inflammation. Your joints ache. You lose your balance. Mota is arguing that the human soul reacted with the exact same violent physiological response.
A spiritual fever.
Yes. The fever of the soul was this immediate, paralyzing relational and spiritual disorder. They hid in the dark. And from that initial patient zero infection, those spiritual toxins multiplied, mutated, and spread exponentially across human history, manifesting as pride, violence, systemic lies, corruption, and warfare.
The analogy that perfectly captures that mechanism for me is a highly sophisticated computer virus disguised as a mandatory software update.
Oh, that's a good one.
The serpent approaches the human firewall and says, "Look at this fruit. This is an upgrade to your operating system. Your eyes will be opened. You'll have admin privileges." It looks totally desirable. But the very millisecond they click install, the payload deploys. It corrupts the root code of their humanity. The entire system crashes, and the glitching, the shame, the hiding, the finger-pointing is immediately visible on the screen.
That's exactly it. The spiritual operating system was fundamentally corrupted at the root level, and humanity lost the ability to self-correct. Which brings us to the core existential crisis Mota is highlighting. If sin is an assimilated, metabolized toxin that causes universal spiritual toxemia, then the human soul desperately needs a spiritual equivalent to the kidneys and the lungs. It cannot survive without an ultimate external filtration system. The toxins will simply build up until spiritual death occurs.
This brings us to the profound resolution of the opening paradox we started the show with. The ultimate spiritual filter, the mechanism that actually performs the cleansing, is the pure, holy, and immaculate blood of Christ.
Right.
But we have to be incredibly careful here because we just spent an hour discussing actual red blood cells, glomeruli, and hemoglobin. How does the physical blood of a historical figure act as a spiritual filter for humanity thousands of years later?
Well, Mota is explicit that this must be understood theologically, not physically. No one is physically washed in literal liquid blood.
Right, that would be absurd and honestly horrifying.
Exactly. The blood represents the surrendered life of Christ, the perfect currency paid to settle the cosmic debt. When the text speaks of the blood cleansing us, it identifies 4 specific non-physical realities, 4 monumental shifts in human standing that are achieved through this spiritual purification.
Okay, let's walk through those 4 realities because they form the actual mechanism of salvation in this framework. What is the first one?
First is the remission of guilt. Second is the cancellation of moral debt. Third is reconciliation with God. And fourth is the renewal of the conscience.
I want to zoom in on that fourth one, the renewal of the conscience.
Yeah.
The source material specifically points back to the New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 14, which states that the blood of Christ purifies our conscience from dead works. Why target the conscience specifically?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's because the conscience is understood teleologically and psychologically as the moral center of the human being. It is the internal judge, the core of your self-awareness and your moral identity. Mota is drawing direct one-to-one parallel here. what the microscopic glomeruli do with deadly chemical toxins like urea and uric acid, the blood of Christ does with the suffocating spiritual weight of guilt, shame, and moral corruption deeply embedded within the human conscience.
Oh, wow. So guilt functions identically to uric acid.
Yes.
Because if you let immense guilt build up inside a human psyche, it poisons their nervous system. It leads to depression, anxiety, a complete inability to function or connect with others. It causes basically a spiritual coma.
It's highly toxic.
So what does this all mean for the second point, the cancellation of moral debt? I need you to clarify something here. Let's really interrogate that. Because if I owe a bank $1 million and the bank graciously decides to cancel my debt, the money doesn't just vanish into thin air.
No, the ledger has to balance.
Right. The bank takes the hit. It costs them $1 million of their own capital to balance that ledger. How does the concept of a moral debt tie back to the biological absolute we established earlier, that blood is the cost of life?
Your bank analogy is actually perfectly aligned with the theological reality here. The ledger must balance. But the debt incurred by the spiritual toxin of sin is not monetary. The wages of sin, according to the biblical text, is death.
Okay.
It is total permanent separation from the source of life. Therefore, to cancel a debt measured in death, life itself must be paid. The bank taking the hit in this scenario is Christ. He absorbs the toxic debt by surrendering his biological life, pouring out his blood to settle the spiritual ledger on humanity's behalf.
He pays the capital.
He pays the capital. And when a person appropriates this reality, when they accept that the debt has been paid, the text says a process of spiritual circulation begins within them. Christ's perfect, uncorrupted life becomes the source of internal renewal. And this spiritual circulation is where the biological analogy reaches its absolute peak, because it perfectly mirrors the simultaneous dual action we spent so much time examining in the lungs and the kidneys.
The feeding and the cleansing.
Exactly. The spiritual blood is doing two completely opposite things at the exact same time.
It delivers the groceries and takes out the garbage.
Precisely. Just as physical blood delivers oxygen and nutrients while removing carbon dioxide and urea, this spiritual circulation executes the same mechanism in the conscience. The text explicitly categorizes what is delivered the spiritual nutrients. They are forgiveness, peace, love, hope, and mercy.
Those are basically the oxygen molecules of the soul. Without hope and forgiveness, the human spirit suffocates.
It really does. And simultaneously, in the very same heartbeat of grace, it removes the spiritual waste products: guilt, fear, condemnation, and inner slavery. This purification is not described as a fleeting emotional high or, the temporary relief of a really good therapy session.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. Mota describes it as a permanent systemic change in one's objective legal position before God. It is a continuous, life-sustaining filtration system installed into the core of the human being.
It is an incredibly elegant, mathematically precise framework. The physical entirely supports the spiritual. But this idea of a total life-sustaining spiritual exchange forces us to confront a final, profound concept found in the scriptures. And honestly, it's one of the most historically controversial, frequently misunderstood, and just visceral passages in the entire biblical canon.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
We have to look at how a person actually participates in this purification, which brings us to the Gospel of John, chapter 6.
Yeah, Mota does not shy away from this text. He directly addresses John 6.53-54, where Jesus is speaking to a massive crowd and delivers a deeply unsettling statement. Jesus says, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life."
We really have to acknowledge how shocking that language is. To a modern ear, without centuries of theological commentary to soften it, it sounds barbaric. It sounds like straight-up cannibalism. Eating flesh, drinking blood. Why would a religious teacher use language so guaranteed to repulse his audience?
Well, it did repulse them. The text records that many of his own disciples walked away that very day, calling the teaching too hard to accept.
I don't blame them.
Right. But Mota provides the crucial interpretive key here. He argues that Jesus is not advocating for literal physical consumption, nor is he speaking in vague, mystical riddles. He is using extreme language to demand what Mota calls existential participation in his life and sacrifice.
Existential participation. How does that abstract philosophical term connect back to our very grounded biological model of the kidneys and the lungs?
Think about the absolute binary of biology. To drink the blood, in a theological sense, means to fully, entirely, and desperately integrate Christ's sacrifice into your own existence. Just as physical blood is absolutely indispensable for biological life. I mean, if you drain the blood from the human body, the organs necrotize and the body dies in minutes.
It's instant.
Exactly. The sacrifice of Christ is equally indispensable for eternal life. Without Christ, the soul remains entirely separated from the source of life, just drowning in its own toxemia.
If I bring back the hemodialysis machine analogy, it crystallizes perfectly for me. To participate existentially means you recognize you are in complete spiritual renal failure. You are dying of toxicity. You cannot just stand next to the divine dialysis machine and admire how beautifully it is engineered.
No, that won't save you.
Right. You cannot just read the instruction manual and appreciate the science. To live, you must hook yourself up to it. You must let the clean blood circulate through your system. The connection must be vital, invasive, and continuous.
That is the exact reality Jesus was driving at. Looking at it through Mota's biological lens, we can see exactly why Jesus was being intentionally, uncompromisingly graphic in John 6. Biology is fundamentally graphic.
It is.
The reality of life and death is a stark, unforgiving binary. A human heart is either beating or it is stopped. Blood is either circulating and purifying, or toxicity is accumulating, leading inevitably to death. There is no middle ground.
Right.
So Jesus uses graphic biological language to express a graphic spiritual reality. You must be intricately, desperately connected to my life, or you will succumb to the spiritual toxins.
It's an absolute binary choice. Life or death. Filtration or toxemia. And that stark reality bridges perfectly into Mota's final conclusions about the deep logical coherence between the physical world God designed and the spiritual realities he revealed. Because this whole deep dive isn't just a neat sermon illustration or a clever metaphor that breaks down if you look too closely at it.
Right, it's not superficial.
Mota is arguing that the analogy is structurally profound all the way down to the cellular level.
He concludes that the correlation is just undeniable. Blood keeps the physical, macroscopic, and microscopic body alive strictly because it constantly circulates, relentlessly feeds, and ruthlessly purifies. Therefore, it makes perfect, coherent, logical sense that the blood of Christ keeps the human soul alive because it constantly reconciles, relentlessly regenerates, and ruthlessly restores.
It is the exact same mechanism applied to a higher eternal dimension of reality.
Yes. It emphasizes that the biblical language of purification isn't just ancient religious mysticism or, primitive superstition. It is deep, sophisticated theological language expressing what the author calls the central, defining reality of Christianity, life offered to restore life.
It creates a unified theory of existence. The God who meticulously engineered the 70 square meters of microscopic alveoli in the human lung to perfectly filter carbon dioxide is the exact same God who engineered a profound spiritual mechanism to filter the destructive, paralyzing toxins of pride, fear, and guilt from the human conscience. The physical machinery points undeniably to the spiritual reality.
It completely changes the paradigm.
It completely shifts how you inhabit your own physical body. Whether you are deeply religious, searching for spiritual truth, or just endlessly curious about how ancient theology intersects with modern biological science, this framework changes your daily experience.
It really does.
Think about it. Every single time you feel your pulse flutter in your wrist, every time you feel your heartbeat thump against your ribs, it is a microscopic, tactile reminder of this grand cosmic narrative. You have a constant biological drumbeat of feeding, cleansing, and restoring echoing inside you right now.
It takes an abstract, thousands of years old theological concept and grounds it into a reality you can literally feel by just placing 2 fingers on your neck. It's an ongoing miracle happening within your own anatomy.
It truly is. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Mota's analysis, Biblico-Scientificus, there is one final provocative thought that emerges from all of this biological and theological heavy lifting. It's something that wasn't explicitly stated in the source text, but it builds directly on the mechanical realities we've been unpacking for the last hour.
Let's hear it.
In the human body, the monumental task of purifying the blood by the lungs and the millions of glomeruli in the kidneys happens entirely, beautifully subconsciously. You don't have to set an alarm to wake up and remind your kidneys to filter out uric acid.
No, thankfully you don't.
You don't have to actively, consciously think about your alveoli exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen while you sleep. They just do it. They operate out of the inherent faithful design of your nature.
Right.
So if this sweeping spiritual analogy holds perfectly true from the macroscopic down to the microscopic, what does that say about the continual, quiet, subconscious grace operating in the life of a person who has embraced this spiritual circulation? Are we perhaps being spiritually purified, forgiven of our daily missteps, and restored moment by moment with every beat of our spiritual heart, even when we are entirely distracted, asleep, or completely unaware of it? Is grace running quietly in the background of our existence, keeping us alive? It's a profound mystery, and definitely something to ponder as you go about your day.